On the assumption that there would be no repercussions, a police officer gives the order for a police dog to attack a black youngster in the park. However, everything changes when the boy's father, who is a police captain, intervenes and insists that justice be served. Subscribe today so that you don't miss what happens next. A cold wind ruffled the leaves on the oak trees, and the faint murmur of faraway conversation filled the air. Are you viewing from the vantage point of the sun as it slowly ascended above the horizon, showering the expansive park in golden light? It was a calm morning with the aroma of newly cut grass in the air, promising an idyllic start to the day. Families sat on picnic blankets, joggers flowed around the paths, and children's laughter rang from the playground. Even though it was a pleasant morning, Officer Rachel Gibbs did not partake in the morning's activities. Taking a leisurely walk down a meandering road RPP, while wearing her clean police uniform, Tranquility was accompanied by her German shepherd, Thor. Thor's black coat shone brightly in the sunshine, and his ears perked in response to every sound. Activity around them, Rachel felt comfort in Thor's presence, since he exemplified order, control, and obedience, which were the exact virtues she took pleasure in as a police officer. However, when she surveyed the environment around her, her mind buzzed with a sensation of apprehension. She thought to herself, "They don't know what it's like to be out here every day." She was upset by the amount of detachment and even scorn that she saw in the couples who were enjoying their morning strolls, and the parents who were playing with their children. People in line ensuring sure the city keeps in order. Her sight wandered to a little kid running up the grassy hill nearby, a young black youngster no more than 6 years old chasing after a toy aircraft. Smiling as he slipped in the grass, his eyes switched to the boy. Rachel halted in her steps, her jaw clenching, and she mumbled under her breath, "What is he doing here?" Thor noticed the shift in her attitude, his ears perking up as he looked the youngster intently. Rachel's grasp tightened around him. Joy seemed to be gnawing at something deep inside Rachel. The leash as an idea took root in her head, a thought that she didn't bother to explore since she didn't think he belonged here. The boy's carefree presence in the park, the way he walked without fear, was a contrast to her natural tendency to push her will on him. Under control, she gave Thor a gently pull and said, "Let's go." Thor let out a faint growl, his muscles tensing up in anticipation. The youngster, who was oblivious of the storm that was forming, kept playing, and he pursued his toy down the hill while laughing nervously. Suddenly, as it dropped farther away from his grip, he stumbled and fell to his knees, scratching them slightly. However, he was too busy with his toy to see Rachel watching carefully, her pulse pounding with an unusual sensation of joy. "All right, Thor," she mumbled. Rachel let free of Thor's leash before she had a chance to second-guess her choice. The German shepherd's muscular legs pushed him across the field in a flurry of motion, his fangs bared, his bark sharp and loud. And the youngster was startled. The dog surged forward like a bolt of lightning, racing at the child who was unaware of what was happening. Clutched his toy aircraft, which was sliding out of his grasp as terror immobilized him. His eyes dilated, and he opened his lips to scream, but the sound got lodged in his throat. The shepherd reached him within seconds, pushing him down into the ground. The child's little body struck the grass with a thud, and Thor's paws held him down while snarling violently inches from his face. With aid, the youngster eventually managed to scream out, his voice breaking with terror. Rachel remained at a distance, observing with a chilly detachment, and she did not try to rescue the boy. There was a strange thrill in seeing the child squirm under Thor's weight. The dog growled loudly, saliva pouring from its teeth as it hovered over the youngster who was now sobbing. She believed her pulse increased, but it was not because she was concerned. She hoped that a little terror would teach him. People in the vicinity began to notice the disturbance in an uncontrollable manner. A mother who was sitting on a nearby bench startled and grabbed her kid closer. A runner stopped in the middle of their stride and pulled out their phone to capture the incident. The murmurings became louder, and a woman's voice could be heard. Rachel stayed glued to her post, unaffected, as the youngster's pleas became more desperate, and tears started to stream down his cheeks. A small crowd began to gather, muttering and pointing at the boy who was stuck beneath the imposing dog. Someone cried, "Help him!" Rachel remained unmoved. As he frantically yelled out for assistance, "Daddy, Daddy, help!" a towering figure emerged from the other end of the park. It was Michael Harper, the boy's father and the captain of the team. He was advancing quickly through the mob. Local police department, he had been out for a morning run when he heard the unmistakable bark of a police dog, followed by the sound of his son's cry filled with terror. Daniel Michael's booming voice sliced through the commotion like a whip. Rachel was a member of the local police department. Michael was already racing toward them, his face a mask of fury and astonishment. Michael yelled, his voice quivering with hate, "Trying to get that monster off of my kid." Thor's bark lessened, and the dog retreated. She tensed as she recognized him immediately. Her grasp on Thor's leash weakened, but it was too late. Automatically turned toward Rachel, waiting for her instruction. But Rachel, frozen by the weight of Michael's attention, hesitated. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Michael shouted, while crouching next to Daniel and trying to draw his kid into his arms. The kid clung to him closely while still crying, his small hands holding his father's running shirt. Michael's heart hammered as he looked Daniel over, wiping the tears off the boy's cheeks. Rachel, who had now regained her calm, attempted to defend the situation. Rachel squared her shoulders in an effort to keep her authority and said, "I was doing my job." Michael stopped her off with a stern glare and added, "You think it's okay to sick a dog on a child on my child?" Rachel made an effort to maintain her authority. Michael's voice dripped with astonishment. Michael's voice dripped with disbelief. 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 Michael's voice dripped with. Encounter parents glared at Rachel, some of whom were muttering under their breath about the use of force that was not necessary. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with outrage and indignation. Thor whined softly, sensing the unease that existed between the humans. Rachel gave a sharp tug on his leash, pulling the dog back to her side. Michael Harper's eyes were fixed on hers, and there was no mistake the hatred that was in them. "You don't get to walk away from this," Michael cautioned, his voice low and calm, even if his anger was simmering just under the surface. However, the damage had already been done. The surface, Rachel crossed her arms, her attitude uncompromising. "I was following protocol." Michael sneered, shaking his head in amazement. "Procedure? If this is your concept of protocol, you have no right wearing that badge," the audience muttered in agreement. "I was following protocol." Rachel's hands shook slightly, but she concealed her nervousness with a stern look as Michael stood holding her. Their shouts were becoming louder because they were in agreement. Some of them yelled at Rachel to apologize, while others demanded responsibility. "You'll be hearing from me, Officer Gibbs, and I guarantee you that this isn't done yet." Rachel watched him walk, her heart pounding, and she knew exactly who Michael was. Daniel was in his arms, and he drew closer to Rachel. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it was loaded with steel. After the event with Thor, the German Shepherd, the park had fallen into an eerie calm, and the formerly serene air was now heavy with anxiety. Harper was, and now she knew just how terribly she had underestimated the situation. As Captain Michael Harper cradled his son Daniel in his arms, the little boy clung to his father. His tiny body was shaking, and his sobs were muffled against Michael's chest. His knees were scratched, and the terror that emanated from him only served to feed the anger that was already simmering within his father, Rachel. In an effort to preserve some sort of control, Gibbs stayed fixed to her position, her posture tight. Her thoughts raced with a combination of amazement and frustration at how rapidly the situation had spun out of control. Gibbs had experienced confrontation in the past, but she was not prepared for this one. Nothing like this. Her pulse raced as Michael turned back toward her, his face a storm of rage and bewilderment. Michael's eyes pierced into her, fierce and unyielding. "You think you can simply walk away from this?" His voice was low, but the intensity of his gaze was clear. Rachel made a concerted effort to stifle her increasing panic. "Captain Harper." "I don't you Captain Harper me." Michael cut her off, his voice rising as he moved forward. "You attacked my son. You put your dog on him like he was a criminal. He's a kid." His voice was rising as he stepped forward. "You attacked my son. You placed your dog on him like he was a criminal." Rachel tensed up in an attempt to preserve what little power she had left. He was acting suspiciously, and she repeated her words, even if they lacked the conviction they had before. Michael's eyes widened in surprise. The words hit like a hammer, leaving little place for Rachel to hide behind her authority. His voice boomed across the park, garnering even more attention from passers-by who had gathered with their phones aloft, filming every word and every action. "You see a black youngster, and that's your first impression, isn't it? He's 6 years old." His voice roared across the park. Rachel's face flushed with suspicion, and she opened her lips to speak, but the words seemed to escape her. That's not to say that was stuttering, but Michael wasn't listening. His fury was too powerful and too raw. "Do you even know who I am?" Michael demanded his attention. Rachel's heart sped as she had known Michael Harper for years, but she had always known him from a distance. He had a reputation for being a fair and impartial person. His voice was still boiling, but it was now controlled. "You work for me. I am your captain. I will not let this slip." She never expected that she would find herself on the receiving end of his rage, and even worse, the knowledge dawned on her that her actions today had crossed a boundary that may ruin her. She was a committed leader who was highly regarded by the department. Career, but she could not afford to show weakness now, not in front of all these people. She straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, and she insisted that she was doing her job, even though her voice lacked the conviction it had once held. "I was making sure that she was doing what she was working for." The safety of the park. The youngster was behaving strangely, and I followed procedure. Michael repeated the term as if it were poison on his lips. "Your policy is to attack children now to release a dog on a 6-year-old boy. Your protocol is to attack children." The fractures in Rachel's calm began to indicate that the throng was expanding, and the murmur of people surrounding them only increased. He shook his head with disbelief, saying, "You think you're above the law, don't you? Because you wear that uniform." He said this without even appraising the circumstances. Increased her level of concern. She looked around and saw that there were several phones pointing in their direction, filming every second. Her co-workers would see this, her supervisors would see this, and before long the whole city would be aware of what had occurred in the park. Today, before she could react, Michael's attention turned back to Daniel, who was still holding his father's shirt. His body was trembling with faint tears, and Michael sat down and pulled his son closer to him. "Are you okay, buddy?" he murmured, softly stroking his fingers over his hair. "Daniel's hair. Did the dog harm you?" Daniel shook his head, though his face was still pale with terror. "I was only playing daddy," he muttered, his voice cracking. "I didn't do anything wrong." Michael's heart tightened When he heard the sound of his son's words, he kissed Daniel on the forehead and got back up. His eyes hardened as it returned to Rachel, and he added, "This ends now." He spoke it gently, but with such a deadly severity that Rachel couldn't ignore it. "You will be held accountable for this." She could feel the weight of the crowd's judgment pushing in on her like daggers in her back. Her pulse beat in her ears as she raced to find an answer, anything that may salvage the situation. Rachel gulped her mouth dry. She could feel the weight of the crowd's judgment crushing on their staircase. Situation. But before she could speak, one of the witnesses stepped forward and said, "That's right, she should be arrested." A voice rang out from the crowd, and it was a man standing with his phone raised. "You can't just attack a kid and get away with it," the man said. As more people joined in, some of them demanded that Rachel apologize, while others called for her resignation. The fury of the audience was tangible, and it was obvious that they were on Michael's side. Rachel's chest clenched as she looked at the tape of the phone conversation. She pushed herself to take a step closer, her voice becoming softer but still attempting to keep some semblance of authority. "Captain, I didn't plan for this to happen." The situation was sliding out of her grasp quicker than she could have anticipated. Every second, the situation was slipping out of her hands. Michael's stare became more resolute, and it was obvious that his tolerance was running thin. "It was a misunderstanding that my kid might have been gravely wounded if I hadn't been present." He didn't continue the statement, but the situation was resolved. Rachel opened her lips to answer, but just then a guy in the crowd stepped up and said, "I got everything on camera." He then held out his phone for Michael to view, and he continued, "You should take this to internal." The implication lingered in the air like a thundercloud. "Affairs, this is police brutality, plain and simple." The audience muttered in agreement and Rachel's stomach fell. "Internal affairs, if this went to IIA, it would be a full inquiry, and with the video proof spreading, her career may very well be gone." Michael turned to the guy who was holding the phone and gave a curt nod. "Thank you," he said in a voice that was calm but strained. Then he glanced back to Rachel and stated, "You will be investigated for this, Gibbs, and believe me, there will be consequences." Rachel's thoughts raced as the reality of the situation came crashing down around her, upon her. She had made a huge error. She had miscalculated Michael Harper and the response of the public. What she had believed would be a straightforward act of preserving control had turned into a nightmare, and there was no going back now. Michael gave her one more glance before leaving. He turned and went away, holding Daniel in his arms. The throng parted for him, and as he passed, he remarked, "I'll be filing a report with IIA today." He replied, "I suggest you get lawyer with that." His countenance was filled with both despair and resolve. Despite the fact that others were murmuring words of encouragement and giving their support, Rachel remained frozen in place. Her mind was still whirling from the meeting, and her pulse was hammering in her chest. As Michael faded from view, the truth of what had just occurred struck Rachel like a tidal wave. Rachel let out a trembling breath as she felt the eyes of the audience lingering on her body. Her reputation, all she had fought for, was now hanging by a thread. She looked down at Thor, who was sitting patiently by her side, unconscious of the drama that had just transpired. Her body felt heavy with the weight of her error, and as she stood there surrounded by judgment, she knew that the worst was yet to come. Michael Harper sat in his office, a heavy stillness creeping over him, the wrath from the park incident lingering. Persisted, but now it was concentrated into a determined determination. The picture of his scared son laying powerless under Thor's weight plagued his thoughts, motivating his resolution to act as captain. He had the ability to launch an internal inquiry, and that was precisely what he meant to. The complaint was straightforward. It was a formal claim of misconduct against Officer Rachel Gibbs for the unreasonable use of force. He took a deep breath and brought out the relevant documentation. His fingers moved slowly over the keyboard as he prepared the complaint. He did this regardless of the expense. As the words filled the screen, Michael was distracted from his thoughts by a pounding at the door. He looked up as the knock jolted him out of his reverie. The report featured full details of the occurrence, as well as references to the video footage that was caught by witnesses. To find one of his fellow cops, Detective Simmons, waiting at the doorway. Simmons was a veteran officer who was older than Michael and had a reputation for understanding which fights to fight and which to avoid. Michael was surprised to see Simmons standing in the doorway. Michael sat back in his chair and crossed his arms as he addressed the question. "I don't have a choice," he said calmly. "What she did was wrong," he said. Simmons came farther into the room. His tone was a combination of curiosity and worry. Locking the door behind him, he added with caution, "Look, I get it, but this is going to stir things up. Gibbs has connections, power, and powerful ones, and some people in the department aren't going to appreciate you coming after her." Michael's mouth locked in place. Simmons sighed and rubbed the back of his neck as he pondered the situation. "I just hope you know what you're getting yourself into, because this could get ugly very quickly," he said. I don't care who her friends are, my son was attacked by one of our own. The wheels were now in action and there was no going back. The complaint would go directly to internal affairs. Michael gave a brief nod and let it go as Simmons exited the office. Michael continued to gaze at the report on his computer for a minute more before pushing the submit button. Word of the event spread like wildfire inside our recordings from the park, which had gone viral and were making their way throughout social media platforms and news outlets. This prompted an official inquiry, which would compel the department to face one of its own employees. Outlets' hashtags asking for accountability took popularity, and the public was eager to vent its fury across screens. Stories flashed across screens including the following. Officer lays police dog on kid, father demands justice. Police captain's officer sets police dog on child. Local activists organized rallies outside the police station demanding an immediate suspension of Officer Gibbs. Comment sections were flooded with indignation, with some individuals sharing their own experiences of how their son was abused by other cops K9, and the public's reaction was tremendous. Misbehavior by the police, others questioned if Gibbs had acted out of racial prejudice, which intensified the scrutiny around the case. Meanwhile, the department found itself under growing pressure to react, and the chief called for an emergency. Encounter, Michael was aware that the inquiry was going to be met with opposition, not just from Gibbs, but also from the very individuals he worked with on a daily basis. Later that afternoon, Michael convened in the conference room with his other officers, and the mood was tense and heavy with unsaid animosity across the table. Rachel Gibbs sat with her arms folded, flanked by two senior officers who were visibly uncomfortable with the situation. The chief, a stern-faced man named Wallace, opened the meeting with a curt nod toward Michael. Captain Harper, I understand you filed a formal complaint against Officer Gibbs. Michael met the chief's gaze. Wallace groaned and leaned back in his chair, saying, Yes, sir, her actions were unjustified, and there needs to be accountability. We are already receiving criticism from the media, and the public is wanting a response, but I need to know if you are certain that this is the case. The correct move we've got to consider about the department's reputation. Michael's rage flashed, though he kept his voice calm. This isn't about the department's reputation, it's about doing what's right. One of the senior officers chimed in, his voice laced with, Ms. Gibbs has been with us for years. She is a good officer. Are we really going to put her under the bus over a misunderstanding? Michael turned to face him, his demeanor as harsh as he could possibly be. A decent policeman would never let a dog loose on a kid. It wasn't a misunderstanding, it was carelessness. Gibbs, who had been quiet up until this point, finally spoke up. I was following procedure, Captain, and her voice was calm, but there was an evident edge to it. I didn't intend any harm to Michael's. The tension in the room was evident, and for a little period no one spoke. Wallace cleared his throat, signifying the conclusion of the conversation. My kid might have been gravely harmed, and his eyes narrowed in purpose. This does not explain what occurred. Debate the inquiry will go as needed, he added, although his tone indicated that he wasn't delighted about it. But I urge that we all try carefully. This department can't afford another scandal. As the meeting concluded, the meeting was adjourned. Up to leave, but Gibbs gave him a harsh look and said, You're making a mistake, Harper. She repeated it in a low voice. This won't end the way you think it will. Michael didn't respond. Instead, he simply turned and walked out of the room, his resolve becoming more resolute with each passing moment. Angela, Michael's wife, was sitting at the kitchen table with her arms crossed, and her look was a combination of anxiety and annoyance. She said, You know they're going to come after you, right? Michael and his family were experiencing a great deal of strain at home. Low but forceful. They are going to make this about you, not Gibbs. Michael slumped against the counter and rubbed his temples. I don't care what they do. This isn't about me, it's about Daniel. What she did was terrible, and she has to apologize for it. Be held responsible. Angela sighed, her expression softening as she gazed toward their son, who was cuddled up on the sofa, hugging a toy animal. Daniel hasn't been the same since it occurred, she said, and he won't even go outside to play Michael's heart act, which was located by the side of the couch. Due to the fact that his kid was so young and susceptible, he was aware that continuing the inquiry would not only be costly for him, but also for his family. However, the idea of allowing Gibbs to go without any repercussions was very distressing to him. I have to do this for him for all the children who have been abused like this, he continued as he crossed the room to sit next to Angela. I have to do this for all of the children who have been treated like this. Angela gave a little nod, but anxiety still clouded her eyes. Just promise me that we will get through this. You'll be cautious, okay? I can't lose you over this. Michael kissed her on the forehead, his voice calm but resolute. I promised the inquiry had officially started, and the public was watching intently. Michael was aware that the path that lay ahead of him was going to be difficult, would be challenging, full of opposition and pushback. But as he looked at his son, who was sleeping soundly on the sofa, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was determined to see this through to the end, no matter what it took. Justice needed to be served, and this time there would be no pushback. Rachel Gibbs sat at the side of her bed, her thoughts racing as she held her phone and scrolled through the innumerable messages she received from her fellow police. Some of the messages they sent were compassionate, while others were plainly contemptuous. The majority of people advised her to keep her head down until the inquiry was over, but Rachel knew better than to do so. Michael Harper had made certain that this would not be the case. Rachel's uneasiness turned into rage as she threw the phone onto her bedside table. But this was no longer just about her job anymore. Harper's complaint was threatening to unravel all she had created if she lost her badge. What was left? The animosity gnawed at her, and the fact that Harper outranked her just made the situation worse. Rachel slipped on her uniform and proceeded to the precinct. She needed friends since the only way to battle Harper was from the outside. She thought angrily, he thinks he can ruin me. Her fists were clenched, and she was determined not to let him win. Officers whispered to one another as she passed through the station, their eyes flickering with suspicion. Some of them, she knew, were waiting to see if she would be taken down, while others avoided her entirely, fully aware that her downfall could drag them into the mud with her in the locker room. The atmosphere at the station was tense. Saw Detective Simmons resting against a bench and scrolling through his phone. He glanced up as she entered and gave a small nod while still breathing. He murmured, trying to get Rachel's attention. Rachel responded with a smirk, but it didn't reach her eyes. She sat down opposite him and rubbed her head. I am in need of assistance. Simmons Harper is out for blood, and if I don't fight back, I will be done. Simmons arched an eyebrow and remarked, You poked the wrong bear. Rachel Harper is not the kind of man to back down, which is why I need leverage, she stated in a hushed voice. Something that would cause him to reconsider his decision to bring me down with him. Simmons stopped, looking around the empty room before moving in closer. He cautioned, Be careful. People are already talking and you don't want to make this worse for them. Rachel let out a harsh exhalation, her aggravation growing to the point where it was already becoming worse. As she exited the station, her mind raced, and she realized that she needed to move quickly if Harper wanted to fight. Meanwhile, Michael Harper sat at home. Angela's face was furrowed with anxiety, and her hands were crossed firmly in front of her. She questioned, with her voice barely above a whisper, How much longer do you think this is going to go on? He was sitting across from his wife at the dining table, and tiredness was weighing heavily on him. Speak as long as it takes, Michael responded. He turned towards the living room where Daniel was sitting quietly with a book. His eyes cast a downcast of a vibrant and playful child that he once knew had been replaced by a silent ghost of himself. Angela remarked softly, He's scared. Michael rubbed his hands over his face, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. I know he said it, but I can't back down now. If I let this slide, what kind of message does that send to him, or to the other kids who are in this mess at work? Michael hasn't slept properly since it happened, and now you're getting pulled deeper into this mess at work. Look like him, Angela's eyes softened. I just don't want this to break you, Michael. You've been fighting your entire life, and I know you'll fight this too. But just be cautious of yourself. Michael nodded slowly. I'll be right back. Michael stared at the screen of the phone that buzzed on the table as they sat in silence. It was an email from Internal Affairs, an official notification that the inquiry against Rachel Gibbs had started, and it was attached. Be cautious, but I need to see this through. There were early testimonies from witnesses, including one officer who had previously spoken out anonymously to support Michael's claim. However, there was more. A second email from an unknown source suggested that previous accusations against Gibbs charges that had been surreptitiously held back. Discarded over the years, Michael's heart raced. This was precisely what he needed to construct his case. He emailed the emails to his lawyer. His determination was hardening. Gibbs wasn't simply going to walk away from this, he would make sure that it was back at the station. Rachel Gibbs was taken care of. She was already on the offensive as she sat in the office of her union representative. Her jaw clenched as they reviewed the matter. You have options, the representative remarked as she flipped through a big packet of documentation, indicating that you have the ability to assert that Harper's position is unacceptable. Rachel grinned, even though it seemed hollow, since she believes that anybody is going to buy it, or that it doesn't matter whether they buy it. You know, actions are personal, and you can make it about prejudice by saying that he is using the issue involving his son to target you unjustly. Rachel nodded slowly, the gears spinning in her head even though it was a dirty strategy. But if it meant protecting her career, then it was worth it. The representative responded with a shrug, saying, "What matters is planting the idea, making Harper look like the one with an agenda, and casting doubt on his motives." Her willingness to use it, she stood up, smoothing her uniform. Do it. Whatever it takes. As the day went on, tensions at the precinct began to mount. Michael could feel the walls closing in as whispers circulated across the department. Gibbs was playing dirty, and she was prepared to use it. It was only a matter of time until the pressure increased that evening, as Michael sat on the porch with Daniel beside him. The kid finally spoke, and he said, "Are you going to stop her?" Michael glanced down at his son, his heart throbbing at the terror that was there in the boy's face. He threw an arm around Daniel's small shoulders and said, "I'm going to try, buddy. I promise." Daniel looked up at him with wide, hopeful eyes and asked, "What if they don't listen?" Michael sighed and pulled his son closer to him. "The boy will make them listen." Nodded softly while laying his head on his father's side, Michael glanced out into the lowering sky, his determination blazing hotter than it ever had before. The struggle had only just started, and Michael Harper was prepared to fight for his son, for justice, and for every other person. Kid who had ever been treated cruelly, Michael Harper came into the station the next morning with his head spinning with ideas of the investigation. He had spent the night analyzing witness testimonies and gathering information to enhance his case against Rachel Gibbs, the defendant in the case. Despite the fact that the disclosures about her past of wrongdoing had only served to strengthen his resolve to follow the process through to its conclusion, each step forward seemed like he was wading farther into perilous waters. The tension inside the precinct was evident, and policemen who had previously welcomed him with warmth now avoided their gaze. The pressure from Gibbs' friends was increasing, and rumors about the probe had gone through the ranks like wildfire. As Michael was making his way into his office, he heard a familiar voice calling out Harper. He turned around to see Investigator Simmons. Leaning against a doorway with a worried expression on his face, Michael gave a curt nod and followed Simmons into an empty conference room. Simmons closed the door behind them and then turned around, folding his arms. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest, man," Michael said. "They are coming at you from every aspect. Mike Gibbs is alleging that you are targeting her personally," adds Simmons, who was crossing his arms and exhaling through his nose as if he was considering his next remarks carefully. I am aware of Michael's response. "This whole inquiry is a vendetta because she reprimanded some of your officers." Michael's jaw tightened, but he pushed himself to remain calm. She is lying. This isn't personal. She is hiding for what she did. I know, Simmons murmured, but the department is attempting to misrepresent the situation. In this manner, they are searching for anything that they can use against you. Michael leaned back, his look becoming more resolute. Let them dig. I have the truth on my side. Simmons offered a tiny laugh that was devoid of any amusement. The truth doesn't always matter, Mike. Angela sat at the din-din table with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, watching the news coverage as reporters speculated on the investigation and twisted the narrative in ways that made Michael appear to be a man on a personal crusade. She knew this better than anyone else at home. Angela was beginning to feel the effects of the pressure. Angela let out a heavy sigh as she turned off the television and glanced toward the living room, where Daniel was quietly playing with his toys. The boy's typical enthusiasm and joy were still absent, and they were replaced by a cautiousness that had not been there before. During the event that occurred when Michael arrived home that evening, Angela greeted him at the door with a look of dread written across her face. "They are saying that you are biased," she said, her voice thick with anxiety. "They are trying to make it look like you are doing this out of revenge." Michael shrugged off his coat. Angela's eyes softened as she moved closer to Michael and placed a hand on his arm. "I just don't want you to lose yourself in this, Michael. You've been through so much already," he said with a weary grin. "They can say whatever they want, I'm not back and forth." Angela's eyes softened as she went closer. Angela gave a little nod, but the anxiety that was visible in her eyes did not go away. She was brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "I'm doing this for Daniel, for all the kids who get treated like this," she said. "Just be careful, okay?" He promised that the following day Michael would meet with the Department of Internal Affairs investigator, a sharp-eyed lady named Evelyn Hart. She was renowned for her no-nonsense attitude, and Michael felt a sliver of comfort knowing that she was assigned to the case. Hart spelled out the facts of the situation. Recent discoveries: a number of officers had come forward with complaints about Gibbs, some of whom were too terrified to testify. But a few officers had consented to provide anonymous statements, and their accounts formed a damning picture of Gibbs's history of misconduct, excessive force and abuses of authority, all of which had been discreetly put under the floor until now. "It's worse than we imagined," Hart remarked as she flipped through her notes. "The department covered for her many times, and they'll attempt to do it again if we don't stop them." "Don't act hastily," Michael nodded. "I'm not going to let them get away with it this time." But just as things appeared to be turning in his favor, new hurdles emerged. Gibbs' allies within the department were working behind the scenes to put pressure on witnesses to recant their statements. Statements were made, threats were made, and several officers pulled out of their positions out of fear of reprisal. Michael understood that he needed a breakthrough via something that would push the department to take action. And regardless of how hard they tried to protect Gibbs, that breakthrough arrived. Marcus Fletcher, a former officer who had left the police years ago due to a disagreement with Gibbs, came out to Michael in an unexpected manner. Marcus had left the force following a disagreement with Gibbs, and now he was prepared to testify that she had damaged my career. Michael informed Marcus during their conversation, "But I've since moved on." Michael's pulse was pounding as he grabbed the files from Marcus, flicking through the papers and evidence, and this was precisely what he needed to take the investigation further. He had the receipts, emails, reports, and everything else that they had covered up. If you are prepared to fight for it, you can have it all. Moving ahead, the following few days were a flurry with Marcus's testimony, and the mountain evidence Michael's case against Gibbs gathered pace. Hart arranged a disciplinary hearing, and the date was set. The department had no option but to continue, and Gibbs knew exactly what was going to happen. Because time was running out, Gibbs made a public statement in which she accused Michael of using his position to settle personal scores. She portrayed herself as a victim by asserting that she had only been doing her job on the day that she met Daniel in the park. But the public did not believe her. Gibbs's attempt to save herself was unsuccessful. If the video evidence was able to speak for itself and other witnesses came forward to buttress Michael's case, Social media would erupt with support for Michael and Daniel, and demonstrations outside the precinct would get louder and more demanding. Michael knew that the struggle was far from over as the day of the hearing came. Gibbs's cronies were still working behind the scenes to attempt to influence the conclusion in her favor, but Michael was ready. He had the truth on his side, and this time there would be no hiding. Michael was ready to take responsibility. During the beginning of the disciplinary hearing, the room was filled with anxiety as a result of it. A large mahogany table extended across the front of the room, and a panel of senior officers and legal representatives sat at it, each of them holding a stack of documents in front of them. The departments. Michael Harper sat at one side of the room, his stance straight and serene despite the fact that his pulse was pounding in his chest. His lawyer was a keen observer. Insignia was hanging on the wall, serving as a strong reminder of the power and scrutiny that permeated the area. Rachel Gibbs, who was sitting across from Michael, and dressed neatly in her uniform, projected the picture of a loyal cop who had unfairly accused her counsel. Naomi Clark, a lady with a dark-eyed woman, muttered last preparations to him, but Michael's attention remained concentrated on the other table. The hearing started with the chief's statement, which set the tone for what would be a lengthy and arduous procedure. Both sides were given the chance to make their case. Gerald Foster, a guy who was known for his smooth talk, sat next to her with a smug smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "I stand here not only as a parent," he continued, "but as an officer devoted to justice." What occurred in the park that Michael rose to his feet and took a big breath as he addressed the panel. Michael rose to his feet and took a deep breath as he addressed the panel. It was not an accident, and it was not a mistake. Rather, it was an abuse of authority on the part of Officer Gibbs. His actions were reckless and unwarranted, and they had the potential to endanger my son's life. Worse, his statements were received with silence. As the weight of his testimony began to settle over the room, he went into detail about the events that transpired on that day, beginning with the instant he saw his son trapped under Thor and ending with the confrontation that ensued. Michael said, "This is not about personal vendettas. About holding ourselves accountable as officers. We cannot pick and choose when to follow the law and when to abuse it." The panel nodded solemnly, their expressions inscrutable. But Michael could see their unease. They recognized that this case had become more than just a simple misdemeanor. An inquiry that was conducted internally, it was a public spectacle, and the prestige of the department was at stake. When Michael ended his testimony, Naomi Clark displayed the video evidence. The film showed Daniel laying on the ground worried about Thor. Growling over him as Gibbs stood by, unmoved, the panel watched in quiet, the terrible truth of the film that could not be denied. Then followed the testimony from witnesses, some of whom testified anonymously out of fear of punishment, while others spoke in public. Person to recount the events, it was obvious that Gibbs had a pattern of inappropriate behavior. This wasn't the first time she had crossed the line, and if action wasn't taken, it wouldn't be the last time she did so. Gerald Foster leaned back in his chair as the panel turned to Gibbs, and his confidence was palpable as he spoke. Presented her statement. Officer Gibbs has been serving our department with distinction for many years. Foster started out nicely, and she has been on the front line safeguarding our community. What occurred at the park that day was a regrettable misunderstanding, and she responded out of prudence rather than fear. She continued, "I believed he was acting suspiciously, and I made a split-second decision to release Thor. It was never my intention to hurt anyone." Malice Gibbs adjusted her seat, her demeanor perfectly bland. "I didn't mean to harm the boy," she said. "It was never my intention to hurt anyone." Michael squeezed his hands under the table, his wrath boiling just below the surface. It was obvious that Gibbs was attempting to portray herself as the victim, a committed cop caught in an unfortunate circumstance. Foster stated that Gibbs was trying to portray herself as the victim. He claimed that Captain Harper, who was turning toward Michael with a practiced grin, is not simply a worried parent. He is also the captain of this precinct, and he has a personal interest in seeing Officer Gibbs. This was his explanation, in an effort to throw doubt on Michael's motivations. Michael could feel the weight of Foster's words crushing down on him, and he understood better than anybody that this strategy would make the victim into the perpetrator, transfer the responsibility and punish him. The panel whispered among themselves, and Michael could feel the weight of Foster's words weighing down on him. Muddy the waters just enough to create doubt. Just as the tension reached its peak, Naomi Clark stood up and said, "The defense wants to make this about Captain Harper's motives." She said this in a calm manner, but this case isn't about motives. It's about actions such as Officer Gibbs releasing a police dog on a child without just cause. Evidence speaks for itself, she indicated toward the video that was playing on the screen, and we are not here to speculate on Captain Harper's intentions. Rather, we are here to evaluate if Officer Gibbs operated within the confines of the law, and it is abundantly evident that she did not. Just as the panel was getting ready to discuss, the door to the chamber creaked open, and a man came inside. It was Marcus Fletcher, the former cop who had volunteered to testify. The weight of the evidence was obvious, and the panel went quiet. Testimony. As he approached the front of the room, all eyes went to him. His face was set with purpose, and he declared in a calm voice, "I have something to say." Michael shared a look with Naomi, expressing his relief. "I worked with Rachel Gibbs for years, and Marcus started his voice loud and clear. I witnessed personally how she exploited her authority, and this isn't the first time that she has done this." Marcus's testimony was the last piece of the jigsaw. He was a witness who had direct knowledge of Gibbs's misbehavior. As Marcus outlined many incidences that provided incriminating proof of Gibbs's history of misbehavior, the panel listened carefully as Marcus explained the occurrences. The room hummed with whispers as Marcus detailed the incidents. If things does not change, it will not be the last time she uses excessive force. As Michael's evidence progressed, the momentum of the hearing began to turn in this direction. After Marcus had completed his work, he handed over the papers and emails that he had brought with him. There were internal reports and data that created a disturbing picture of Gibbs's condition. The panel attentively examined the facts, and their features were somber with intense concentration. The truth was exposed. The panel decided to take a little break in order to discuss, and Michael sat in silence at the table. Naomi put a calming touch on his shoulder as he rested at the table, his pulse beating in his chest. After what seemed like an eternity, she muttered to her shoulder, "We've got this." Shortly, the panel came back, and the person in charge of the investigation cleared his throat and stared. After going over the data and taking everything into consideration, straight at Rachel Gibbs. Based on the testimony he provided, we have arrived at the conclusion that Officer Gibbs's conduct were in. Officer, this is an obvious breach of department policy, and it will take effect immediately. A collective sigh of relief might be heard when Gibbs is released of her responsibilities. In the midst of the announcement of the verdict, Gibbs remained seated in her chair, frozen in place. A look of bewilderment could be seen on her face when Gerald F. Oster moved very close to her and said something. Contacted her, but she did not answer, and she was not interested in continuing her profession. There was no way to avoid the repercussions this time. Michael quietly let out the weight of the situation. When he felt the weight of the conflict finally lift off his shoulders, he cast a look in Marcus's direction. Received an appreciative nod from him. The battle had been drawn out and arduous, but justice had prevailed. Prevailed as the room became empty, Michael rose up and made his way toward the exit. When Daniel spotted his father and Angela, his face lighted up with excitement. Angela and Daniel were waiting there. After Michael gathered him up in his arms and held him tight, he said, "It's over, buddy." "We did it," Michael murmured, as the repercussions of the hearing reverberated throughout the room. Rachel Gibbs was received with a variety of responses from the department, which served as a shock to the department when the final decision was confirmed. Because of what they saw to be a betrayal of one of their own, some policemen harbored resentment against Michael Harper, while others remained silent. Gibbs was eventually detained by someone, which brought relief to those who supported the conclusion. There was a significant amount of friction between the two factions, and it continued to linger throughout the... However, for Michael, it was a different type of weight that he carried around the corridors of the station. The war that he had waged was ended, yet the triumph seemed like it had not yet settled in his chest. Strangely, there were no celebrations, no triumphs, only the calm. There was nothing but silence. Michael kept his ground the next week after coming to the understanding that doing the right thing did not always feel like a victory. Observing Rachel Gibbs as she made her way across the parking lot from the exterior of the precinct. Her shoulders sagged, and her once imposing shape had shrunk to reveal something more diminutive. She was no longer wearing her uniform, and the badge that she had previously worn was no longer on her person. With pride, which was now little more than a recollection, her face was full of the rage that had blazed so brilliantly throughout the hearing. But as she went past their gaze, it was replaced by a chilly emptiness. Michael was able to detect the resentment in the face of the person he met briefly, but there was no exchange of words. Her eyes, he had anticipated that she would strike out and provide him with one more barb, but she did not. Rather than that, she abruptly turned around and began walking, her form gradually fading down the... As Michael turned to face the street, he let out a sigh, the strain in his chest finally beginning to ease. Upon his return to the inside, the door had just about shut behind him when he was hailed by a handful of his family members. Some of his co-workers showed him reverence by nodding their heads, while others avoided looking at him. In general, he was able to see the change in how he was perceived, which was that he was no longer only their captain, but rather a guy who had. It was not a pleasant position, but it was one that he was willing to take. Exposed one of their own. Michael stayed in his office later that day, peering out the window, but he eventually accepted the offer. The burden of all he had gone through, including confronting his own department, the scrutiny of the public, and the worry for his son's safety, led him to. This was the first time in weeks that he allowed himself to feel secure, and everything seemed to settle all at once. Himself to breathe deeply and completely, safe in the knowledge that the present conflict was all behind him. He was unable to dismiss the sensation that the argument was not about the case against Gibbs, but as he lay back in his chair, he couldn't shake the notion. Had been one case, but the more significant conflict was the one against the structural problems that permitted police like her to function without being monitored, was not at all suitable. Michael, who was done, was aware that this win was just the first stage in a much lengthy process. Taking into consideration his position within the agency and his capacity to effect change from its. In addition to providing him with a platform, inside also made him a target. There would be other obstacles in the future, and he needed to be prepared for some of them. Michael's family had finally begun to feel some relief from the anxiety that had been plaguing them. During the time when Daniel was playing with his toys, Angela was in the kitchen making supper. Something reverberated throughout the home as the boys' laughter reverberated in the living room. At the moment when Michael went through the door, he had not heard anything in what seemed like an eternity. Dr. Daniel's face brightened up as he cried out to his father, heading in the direction of his father with. At the same time that the youngster was giggling, Michael reached out and grabbed him, keeping him close to him. "Did you have a wonderful day, buddy?" What a pleasant sound that filled the room with warmth. To which Michael responded in a quiet voice. Daniel joyfully nodded and said, "I played outside today." Michael grinned, his heart swelled with delight, and said, "That's absolutely fantastic, buddy." "I wasn't afraid." Angela entered in the doorway, drying her hands on a towel. "I am very pleased of those who have achieved success." She smiled conscientiously at Michael, her eyes brimming with the type of calm relief that can only be had after experiencing something intense. Something that was so powerful and emotionally taxing, and dealing with it in a way that was workable. She inquired despite the fact that the inquiry included an implicit acknowledgement of all that they had gone through. Silent Michael. As Daniel was being gently placed down, the respondent said, "No more hearings, no more chaos, just..." Angela, who was doing her typical thing, laughed as she moved closer to throw her arms around him. He nodded his head in agreement as his arms around her. "It's normal," she muttered into his chest. Following supper, they remained silent for a little period of time, appreciating the tranquility that had escaped them for such a considerable amount of time. Michael took Daniel for a stroll in the park, which was the same park where they had been walking earlier. This was the beginning of everything. The air was chilly, and the golden hues of the sunset were bathing A variety of trees belonging to families of warm light were dispersed throughout the grassy edges. The atmosphere was filled with the noises of youngsters playing, dogs roaming about freely, and laughing. Daniel's hand in his Michael's. Michael felt a sensation of air as they traveled down the road known to them. As a result of the park's feeling of closure, it no longer seemed like the location of anxiety and tension that it had always been. Once again, a spot of tranquility where his kid might feel secure. Daniel halted near the hill where the situation had been. The action had occurred, and Michael was watching him with his eyes scouring the ground. He was cautiously awaiting the boy's reaction, wondering whether he would be scared or apprehensive. But Daniel was not. Daniel laughed and added, "Look, Daddy, I'm ready to run." He then released his father's hand and fled. He was running down the grassy hill with the same ecstatic abandon as he had before the event. His laughter reverberated across the park, and Michael couldn't help but grin at the whole thing. The weight of the situation weighed heavily on him, as he remained there for a minute, watching his kid run freely. After what seemed like an eternity, the burden of the last several weeks suddenly lifted off his shoulders. They were able to regain all that they had lost, via the usual course of events. While Daniel rushed back toward him, his face flushed with excitement, Michael was on the verge of passing out. "I love you, buddy," he muttered as he crouched down and drew his kid into a close embrace. "I love you too, Daddy Daniel," he said in a voice that was husky with passion. He responded by putting his arms around Michael's neck for the very first time in what seemed like an eternity. Michael Harper. The war was finished, and he felt at peace, but the lessons he had learned would remain with him. He had battled for justice for all of eternity, not just for his son, but for every kid who had ever been born. Merited the opportunity to grow without fear, despite the fact that there were more conflicts to come. Michael was certain that he has the fortitude, bravery, and will to confront them, due to the fact that he was not only battling for himself, but also fighting for his spouse and children. When they were walking home together for the sake of his community and for justice, saw the park disappearing in the distance, Michael was certain that regardless of the difficulties that remained ahead, because he grasped the situation better than he ever had before, he would confront them head-on. Recognizing the significance of standing up for what was right, despite the fact that the odds were stacked against him, and giving Daniel credit for his family and for each and every kid who would grow up in a world that was just a tiny bit better as a result of his courage and determination. I am grateful to you for watching if you found it enjoyable. It was all worth it. If you liked this video and would want to see more, be sure to click the subscribe button and stay tuned for the next video. There is a lot more to come. More is on its way to you, and while you're here, you may also like to peruse some of our other films. Make sure you don't miss out by subscribing right now, and we'll see you in the next part. I am grateful to you.